Last time we were talking about John Nelson Darby, and I'm going to not say more about his life, but I want to say just a few things, kind of a few little bullets about his thought, especially emphasizing those points where he brings, as I think most people would say who've studied this, unique ideas to the whole question of Christian eschatology. It's called dispensationalism because in Darby's view, history is divided into 7 so-called dispensations. This is the first unique contribution. The idea is that in 7 different eras in history, God has worked out salvation purposes in 7 different ways. The first of these is the era of innocence, the Garden of Eden, the first few chapters of Genesis. This is followed, he says, by conscience, after the fall, but before the flood. From the flood until the call of Abraham, what he calls civil government. This is followed by the patriarchal period, Genesis chapter 12 through Exodus 19, in which the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so on, become the centerpiece of God's redemptive activity. With Moses, we have a new dispensation called law. It begins with the 10 Commandments, continues until the period of the church. The church is called the age of grace. We are living in the church age. It will continue to an indeterminate time in the future, at which point there will be what was called the rapture. The rapture removes the church from the world and gives birth to, then, finally, the kingdom. The kingdom is a millennial kingdom in which Christ is ruling in a political sort of way from Jerusalem over the peoples of the entire world. I want to look at some of these in a little bit more detail before we move on. The millennium itself is a standard premillennial conception. The idea that Christ reigns for a 1,000-year period of time, reigns from Jerusalem. All of this he shares with other premillennialists who basically developed similar ideas at that time in history. The millennium is immediately preceded by the second advent. Christ comes before the millennium, hence the term premillennialism. However, something unique to Darby's view of this is that the church is not present. All the other premillennial eschatologies see Christ reigning for this 1,000 years through the people who are the ones advocating this particular eschatology. So if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, he's going to rule through the Adventists. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, he's going to rule through the Witnesses. If you're a Mormon, he's going to rule through the Mormons, you see. But Darby has a different view, a very stunning idea that the church is gone. The church is in heaven, and there's a reconstituted state, political state of Israel, and Christ is actually ruling through ethnic Jewish people during this millennial period. I don't think anybody in the history of the church until Darby had ever actually suggested that particular hypothesis. The church has removed, as I say, the term of art that is used is that the church is raptured. The term is not found in the Bible, but it's usually an allusion to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So the church is taken out in a kind of blink of an eye sort of event, and that takes place before this millennial era begins. Old Testament prophecies that look forward to a time of rich blessing, and of course the Old Testament has many of these, Isaiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, others, all sort of look forward. For the most part, all of the prophets have some idea of a great period of blessing in the future. Generally speaking, those have been identified with God's work among his people in some sense or other in unfolding history. Classical Christianity would say those are describing God's blessings on the world through his work in the church, that sort of thing. However, Darby says all of those predictions actually refer to the kingdom, not anything that God is doing through the church. So those prophecies are actually prophecies of a coming millennium. Immediately before the millennium is a period that Darby called the Great Tribulation, borrowing that term, of course, from the New Testament itself. This is a 7-year period of time. It precedes the second coming of Christ. It is also identified by Darby, and again, he appears to be the first one to suggest this hypothesis. He identifies the 7-year period of the Great Tribulation as the 70th week of Daniel. Now, if you've been in the class or have otherwise studied these things, you know that Daniel chapter 9 describes 70 weeks, clearly 70 weeks of years, from the going forth of the order to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of Messiah. So many of the thinkers down through history have played with these 70 weeks of Daniel. All of them, of course, envisioning that the 70 weeks expire with the advent of Messiah and the beginning of the work of Christ through his church and so on. Darby again brings a unique idea that the 70th week is detached from the first 69 and thrust out somewhere in the future, and that 70th week of Daniel is actually identical with the Great Tribulation. If there's ever a point where Darby's analysis has been almost universally criticized by non-dispensationalists, it's here, because at least the general assessment is there is absolutely no exegetical justification for detaching the 70th week from the first 69. It is a somewhat arbitrary construction, but it does make the scheme hang together better to view it that way, so that's what he does. The church is raptured out before the tribulation. Now this again was a notion that seems to have been borrowed from Edward Irving. We talked about him a couple of weeks ago, and at least there's fairly good documentation that Edward Irving got the idea of a tribulation period and a church being raptured out in an ecstatic utterance from a young woman named Margaret MacDonald in one of his somewhat Pentecostal-style meetings, you know. It was not developed by Edward Irving. He didn't work out an elaborate eschatology. But that kernel may have been the most important triggering idea in the whole thought of Darby, and he took that and ran with it a long way. And so it was this pre-tribulation rapture that in a sense became the seed out of which so much of the rest of his eschatological schematic was developed. So the church is not only raptured out before the millennium, actually before this tribulation period. Most of the book of Revelation, according to Darby, is describing events in the future that occur during this tribulation period. This is what's called the futurist view of Revelation, that it's describing events in the future. We've looked at the historicist view in some details. There's other views that were much less influential. The preterist view sees Revelation largely describing events taking place in the first century. Darby becomes the most famous of the futurist approaches to Revelation. During that time, a character known as the Antichrist is going to dominate in the world. He comes in originally as a kind of champion of peace. He makes deals with the nations of the world, essentially putting himself in a position of worldwide prestige. He makes pacts, including a pact with Israel, but then in the middle of this tribulation, 3.5 years in, he breaches that agreement, committing a sacrilegious act at a temple that, of course, has to be rebuilt before any of these could take place. And that gives rise then to 3.5 years of horrific conditions in the world, culminating in a great battle mentioned in Revelation 16 called the Battle of Armageddon. I know many of you are fairly familiar with this, and so all I want you to understand is Darby's the guy who pretty much put this ball in play. And many of the ideas that we have heard of, and part of our cultural heritage really in many ways, especially in evangelical circles, has been the invention, at least and historically speaking, of Darby. Immediately prior to the tribulation era is what's called the church age. The church age commences when ancient Israel rejected Christ as her king. The theory is that Christ came to Israel, said, "Here I am, guys, I'm your king, put a crown on my head and let me start ruling," and Israel instead crucified him, murdered him. And according to Darby, what happened at that point was a prophetic clock stopped ticking. The 69 weeks that had been ticking down through history until the beginning of the 70th week, that clock stopped. And we've been in a kind of historical suspended animation since then, waiting for the 70th week to begin unfolding at the end of history. This opens up what was commonly regarded as a kind of parenthesis. Some of you have seen dispensational charts, especially if you're older and grew up in these circles, showing a great chart with a huge parenthesis in it. Well, we're in this parenthesis, you see. This is the church age, and it is the age that is immediately preceding then the beginning of the tribulation. The church age, according to Darby, is largely invisible in the Old Testament. That is to say, predictive material in the Old Testament largely ignores this parenthetical era in which we are living. It looks forward rather to a kingdom in the future, not to an age in which we're living now as part of the church. Darby believed that history would spiral downward precipitously toward the end. This is true pessimistic premillennialism, and that Christ comes, in a sense, at the last possible moment to rescue his people, in this case, the people of Israel. Another of the points where Darby brings what is really an astonishing innovation, and a point that has been, I'll just tell you, quite an embarrassment in more recent years in dispensational thought, and you don't hear much about it anymore, but it was explicit in original dispensational thought, and that is that the Bible must be rightly divided. That was a catchphrase in dispensationalism and continued to be so for many, many years into the 20th century. The idea here is that not all the Bible applies to God's people. That is to say, people who are like us in the church. Not only does the Old Testament basically not apply to us, but much of the New Testament does not apply to Christian people. It applies to the kingdom. Darby, for example, said the Sermon on the Mount does not apply to Christian people. Much of the Synoptic Gospels does not apply to Christian people. The parts of the New Testament that apply principally to Christians would be Paul's letters. Darby tended to shun notions of law, of obedience. This is the age of grace. For that reason, dispensationalism has often been charged with a kind of antinomian spirit, a sort of spirit of lawlessness. I'm not going to push that point too far, because I think there's been a lot of attempts in recent years among dispensationalists to regroup on that, and so it wouldn't be so much the case today. But certainly traditionally, that was a charge that was brought in dispensational circles because of the idea that we are under grace, you see, and grace itself is the only drummer to which we march. There's no notion of obedience or law or anything that is of great importance. If any of you have kind of been tuned into this debate in recent years, the whole contest about lordship salvation, which has been an issue in the last 20 to 30 years in some circles, has been over this precise point. So it's not as if it's gone away. It still continues to be an issue of some importance and discussion. Darby's view that the Bible must be rightly divided was one of the most important original notions. One particular historian who treats the beginnings of dispensationalism, named Ernst Sandin, writes this. This is part of his quote. He says, "If one accepted Darby's view of the secret rapture," Benjamin Wills Newton pointed out, "then many gospel passages must be, quote, renounced as not properly ours," referring to Christians. This is precisely what Darby was prepared to do. Darby was prepared to say that major parts of the New Testament do not apply to Christian people. The quote continues, "Too traditional to admit that biblical authors might have contradicted each other, and too rationalist to admit that the prophetic maze defied penetration, Darby attempted a resolution of his exegetical dilemma by distinguishing between Scripture intended for the church and Scripture intended for Israel. So part of the New Testament applies to Israel and not the church. Most of the Synoptic Gospels, for example. Some of the New Testament applies to the church and not Israel. Paul's letters, for example. But very little of the New Testament applies to both. You kind of get the idea. That's that rightly dividing notion. The task of the expositor of the Bible was, in a phrase that was to become the hallmark of dispensationalism, quote, rightly dividing the word of truth, borrowing Paul's phrase, but certainly that's not what Paul meant. That's not the sense of that phrase in the way that Paul expressed it there. All right. That's dispensational. Sorry, Bruce, that's the best I can do, but there you are. But that's kind of at least the innovations that were brought to the table, and I hope that's helpful, because what I'd like to do now is trace how did we get from there to here in terms of American culture. And the character that really becomes the most important bridge between Darby, who was an Englishman, and American conservative Christianity was a fellow by the name of James H. Brooks, who happened to be, friends, a Presbyterian pastor. So we made the big time here. This is the pastor of the Walnut Street Presbyterian Church. He was, for many years, the most prominent dispensationalist during its period of growth, and he was inspired to this position of influence by hosting John Darby in his church on several occasions. Darby came to America, preached here and there to some modest audiences, but it was really Brooks who embraced this and began to carry this project forward in a fairly substantial and influential way. Brooks himself was a very competent speaker and writer. He taught, he wrote, he was the editor of a periodical called The Truth, which, along with another periodical called Watchword, were the main voices of dispensationalism in America. It was not a majority view yet by any means, but it was certainly getting traction in American, fairly conservative Christianity at that point. He himself authored some 200 books and tracts. He became the key leader and speaker in an annual event called the Niagara Bible Conference. So in the late 1800s, if you lived in America, you would have heard of the Niagara Bible Conference. It was a major gathering. People would come from all over the country. It was kind of a getaway, you know, but it would be a place where you'd hear speakers speaking to the issue of Christian living, but always peppered through it would be a kind of dispensational idea. We are living in the end times. The evidence is all around us, and references would be made to the current events of the day. Newspaper articles cited, and all of these would be offered as proof that we are living now in the end times, and that this is a time when we need to be bracing ourselves ready for the second coming of Christ. A man who became a close friend of James H. Brooks was named Dwight L. Moody. Dwight L. Moody was a powerful evangelist, kind of like the Billy Graham of his day. He fully embraced a dispensational view and began to pepper into his evangelistic sermons that same kind of end times message. So that became a very important part of his agenda as well. But even more importantly, he befriended a young man who was quite troubled at the time by the name of Cyrus Ingerson Schofield. He included Schofield in a small group of young men that he discipled who were usually young in the faith, and gave them care and guidance in the early days of their Christian adventure. Brooks continues to be a name known in some circles to this day. There is a Brooks Bible Institute in St. Louis, and he's got a website there, and I get no kickbacks if you go and take a look at it, but there it is. That's James Brooks. All right, Cyrus Ingerson Schofield, absolutely the most important character for making dispensationalism more or less ubiquitous throughout evangelical Christian circles in America. Schofield was born in Michigan. He descended actually from English Puritans, but his own family was not overly given to activity or involvement in church. He only attended church fairly minimally growing up. They were nominally Episcopalian. He was, however, a brilliant young man and a voracious reader, and read a lot of the classics, classical literature, Shakespeare, Homer, and others. When the Civil War broke out in 1860, he enlisted in the Confederate Army. He was wounded fairly early at the Battle of Antietam, and on the basis of that successfully petitioned for discharge. That was granted, but then as he recovered, he was drafted. He was conscripted once again into the Confederate Army. At that time, he deserted. I don't know the reason. I don't know if he'd lost confidence in the Southern cause or what. That's fairly obscure, but he deserted. He escaped to the north from Kentucky, and having taken an oath of allegiance to the Union cause, he was given safe passage to St. Louis, which is where Brooks, of course, was laboring. In 1866, shortly after the Civil War, he married into a French Catholic family. By so doing, he inherited a lawyer brother-in-law and asked whether he could be apprenticed into the legal profession by this brother-in-law. That was very common in those days, probably as common as anyone going to law school, maybe more so. So he, for 3 years, was apprenticed and became an attorney in 1869, passed the bar, moved to Kansas with his wife, and virtually overnight became a sensation. He was still a very young man in his 20s, but he was extremely attractive and very powerful in speech and so on. He was actually elected to the House of Representatives of Kansas in 1871, and the following year, at age 29, was appointed a U.S. District Attorney for Kansas, the youngest appointed U.S. District Attorney in the country, 29 years old. So he was quite an astonishing character, but things sort of unraveled at that point. He was actually forced to resign the very same year under what the press called a cloud of scandal. This was based on allegations of having accepted bribes from railroads, stealing political contributions, securing bank promissory notes by forging signatures, and so on. So it was rather a short, brilliant career, ending in somewhat unhappy circumstances. There's some evidence that he may have actually been jailed for a time, but the records are not altogether clear, so we can't say that for sure. It would have been on forgery charges if it actually took place. His professional life, therefore, was hitting the reefs. His personal life wasn't going a lot better. He was a heavy drinker. This is by his own admission, by the way, so this is not, sort of slandering him. This is his own recitation of his history. He abandoned his wife sometime around the year 1880. He had 2 daughters then, his wife, and so even as his professional life had gone into some sort of precipitous dive, something like that happened in his personal life as well. We know that his wife successfully divorced him in 1883 on grounds of desertion. He married, by the way, the same year, another woman with whom he lived for the rest of his life, and it appears to have been a happy marriage. Her name was Hetty Hall Van Warts, and he had 1 son by her, so 3 kids altogether. It was during this time of tumultuous difficulty. He'd come back from Kansas, broken really professionally because of all the scandals that circulated around him, and then that was followed by these personal problems back in St. Louis. There was a friend of his, a lawyer friend, who began to kind of take him under wing and began to talk to him about the need for him to come to some sort of legitimate faith in Christ. We don't know when that happened. We don't know when he made some sort of profession of faith in Christ, but it would have been in a time frame beginning around 1879 and certainly by 1883, and it's just not altogether clear exactly how that happened. We do know that he was participant in helping plan Moody's evangelistic campaign in 1879. We don't know what the state of his heart was, but he was at least doing a little background work in preparation for that. But it was at this time, in the early 1880s, that he came under the mentorship of James H. Brooks. Brooks liked to take in guys who'd had a rough go. He, I'm sure, was a very warm-hearted, pastoral sort of character, and he wanted to bring the young C.I. Scofield into his little inner circle and begin discipling him. Scofield was absolutely fascinated with Brooks. He not only got his basic Christian education for the first time from this man, but of course that Christian education was laced through start to finish with dispensational ideas. So this was the way that Scofield ingested his whole notion of what Christianity is. He was, as I say, a voracious reader, and along the way he read Darby's commentary on the whole Bible. I mentioned that when we talked about Darby last week. Scofield said of Darby, he was, quote, the most profound theologian of our age. I don't know how many other theologians Scofield had read at that point, but this was the one who certainly left an imprint, kind of a DNA imprint on Scofield's thought as he read and ingested the thought, the constructions of eschatology, especially from Darby. In 1883, Scofield was ordained a pastor in the Congregational Church. He didn't go to seminary. This was largely the tutelage that he received from Brooks. But at the end of this time, he became kind of a lay pastor and was eventually ordained into the Congregational Church. His divorce at the time of his ordination was actually still pending. It hadn't been completed yet. But he did, as a result of that ordination, accept a position in a small mission church in Dallas, Texas. He moved there and became the pastor of that church. It exists to this day. It was called then the First Congregational Church of Dallas, Texas, now known as Schofield Memorial Church. So if you're ever in Dallas and want to drop by, that church is there to this day. The church grew respectably during some 10 years, a little more than 10 years he was there. It grew from 14 charter members in 1883 to about 500 in 1895. In 1895, Schofield went to Massachusetts and succeeded D.L. Moody in the church he had been pastoring there in Massachusetts. So Schofield was the person that succeeded Moody in his church. However, he returned to Dallas in 1903 and became the pastor once again of that congregational church. But by this time, he was really recognized in a much broader audience. He was really regarded, I think, by now as the greatest leader of American dispensationalism, following in the wake of James H. Brooks. He wrote a pamphlet in 1888. The title of the pamphlet was Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. In that pamphlet, he argued as a very competent lawyer for the proposition that not all the New Testament applies to Christian people. In particular, passages like the Sermon on the Mount and various teachings of the parables of Jesus, most of the synoptic Gospels, a fair amount of the Gospel of John, parts of the book of Acts, most of Revelation, a lot of the rest of the New Testament does not apply to you and me. That's why in dispensational tradition, you hear a lot of preaching from Paul's letters, not a lot of preaching from the Gospels, and even less preaching from the Old Testament. That's that influence that came through Schofield and before him from Darby. Well, this was a little treatise that argued for that proposition. He was asked to come various places. He spoke a lot. He traveled around. He was a very competent and persuasive preacher. He began to style himself at this point as C.I. Schofield, Doctor of Divinity. Now, people have looked for a seminary degree without finding it, let alone a Doctor of Divinity, even honorary, and have not found it. So I'm going to be gracious here, but I think he's just kind of slipping that in the side door, just kind of throw that little DD in at the end of his name. I don't want to be too dismissive of that, but nevertheless, it just begins to appear as he's circulating publications and so on, publicity material about himself at that time. However, in that era, when he was back in Texas, he really undertook his so-called great project, which was to write a set of notes to accompany the entire Bible, not a commentary on the Bible, but rather a set of footnotes, sometimes extended footnotes, that would go with a Bible. So you'd buy the Bible and you'd have half a page of the Bible text, and then the lower half of the page would be Schofield reference notes. And he went through and did the whole Bible in such a way that it had this running commentary in which all of the texts of Scripture, Old and New Testament, were construed largely along the lines that had been worked out by Darby. And so this Schofield Reference Bible was published in 1909. Over the next 20 years or so, I think it's safe to say it became ubiquitous. If you were an evangelical Christian in America, you owned a Schofield Reference Bible. It swept through the Christian world, especially conservative type Christians, and became just a staple item in the households of Christian people across the country. I think it's a legitimate question to ask why. Why did that happen exactly? And at this point, in the spirit of full disclosure, I'm giving you my theory, okay? So you are listening now to Gore's thoughts. That means you should be very critical and suspicious. But I just want to at least give you my take on why this Bible, written by still a man who had no formal theological education and so on, could have been so widely accepted that it became virtually just part of the household of any Christian family that believed the Bible, at least that believed that they believed the Bible at that time. So what is it? Well, first of all, as you know, early 20th century America saw some amazing splits. There was a split in American Christianity called the Modernist controversy. Some of you are familiar with this time. The Modernist controversy was the conflict in Christianity between a more liberal form of Christianity coming over from the continent and those who were holding fast to the more conservative traditional Christianity that had come down to them through American tradition and so on. And so that so-called modernist controversy was actually contextualized by the Scofield Bible. The Scofield Bible said we are living in the so-called Laodicean age, the age of lukewarmness, the age in which Christian people are beginning to become soft in their commitments. And so a person could read the Scofield Bible and say, well, look at that's what's going on. This is exactly what's happening, you see. And so it seemed to correlate so much with the American experience at that point in their Christian life. The split in Christianity was echoed in the 20s by, of course, the Roaring 20s, the split in American culture between urban and rural America. Rural America remained pretty much committed to traditional Christian ideas. Even people who weren't personally people of faith were nevertheless buying in pretty heavily in classical Christian ethics and so on. In the city, not so much. In the city, we have some experiments that are going in a very different way, and that again seemed to correlate so well with what was being described in the Scofield Bible. The so-called Scopes monkey trial, an epithet assigned by Mencken, if you know that story. The debate over evolution that took place at the Scopes trial, 1925, probably the centerpiece of this whole era. The conservatives, by this time called the fundamentalists, although be careful because the word did not yet have its negative connotations that we tend to attach to it. In fact, it was really the Scopes trial that gave the term fundamentalism some of the negative baggage that we think of. But the fundamentalists were represented by William Jennings Bryan, who represented the defense. Anybody know? Clarence Darrow. And so you've got one of the most famous criminal lawyers, hard leftist, ACLU champion, and one of the most fundamentalist right type Christians conflicted there, and it became the sort of the battle of the century. It was one of the most famous trials of all American history, as you well know. The fundamentalists won the battle and lost the war. The press largely began to treat anybody that took the Bible seriously, at least on these questions, as an idiot, as a buffoon. And Christian people began to feel marginalized, disenfranchised. They had once been on the high ground culturally of this country. All of a sudden, within just a heartbeat, historically speaking, these kind of fundamentalist Christians find that they're being pushed back into the margins and that other forces are taking over. And it looks like what the Scofield Bible has been describing. It gives a justification for the fact that we're losing this position of influence in our culture. At the same time, you have the rise of what's called the Bible school movement. American seminaries, for the most part, went in the direction of modernism. This was called at the time the treason of the scholars. And it became a sort of impression among conservative Christians. If you were scholarly, that made you a suspicious character. If you had too many credentials, if you had too much advanced education, that probably meant that you were actually a closet enemy of the Christian faith. And the seminaries, seeming to go in that direction, created a vacuum. And as a result, there was what was called the Bible school movement, in which all kinds of Bible schools popped up across America, the most famous of which, and one of the first of which, was the Moody Bible Institute. And I used to be an employee of Moody Bible Institute, so I just want to say this very, because I got paid by them for a while, so I want to be very generous in my comments here. But Moody himself was a devoted dispensationalist, and these Bible schools were universally dispensational. They all had Scofield Reference Bibles as part of their required texts. And across the country, you've got the Bible school movement kind of filling in the gap that seems to have been left. They all relied on Scofield's Bible as kind of a staple. The other item that had a huge impact was rising Zionism. Some of you know the name Theodore Herzl. He's sometimes called the founder of modern Zionism. He held a conference in Basel of worldwide fame in 1897, calling for the creation of a homeland for beleaguered Jewish people living in Europe who had been the subject of pogroms and persecutions and displacements. You know the story. It was ugly, awful. And this man, a Jewish man, said that Jewish people deserve their own homeland. There's no known connection between this Zionism and dispensationalism, but the coincidence of the timing is breathtaking. Because, of course, over the next several years, Zionism continued to acquire increasing horsepower, culminating by the Balfour Declaration at the latter part of the First World War, in which A.J. Balfour, speaking for the British government, or at least allegedly speaking for them, said that Her Majesty's government would look with favor on the creation of a national homeland for Jewish people back in the region of Palestine, hoping to bring Jewish men from Russia into the conflict. You know, 1917, that was the Bolshevik Revolution, all that, in order to support the war cause. So what you have is an interesting historical coincidence now that gave huge additional juice to the dispensational view of a reconstituted state of Israel that would be there. Well, of course, as you know, Zionism and this desire for a homeland continued to be an important political issue between the wars. The British mandate that was so difficult in the Middle East and so on finally culminated in a UN-sanctioned creation of Israel in 1948. And that seemed to be the proof of the pudding. How could you dispute now that Darby got the right answer, that Schofield got the right answer? Look at this. We have a state of Israel. And the hypothesis was that if the state was created in 1948, Christ would have to return by 1988 because he would have to return within that generation. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to bypass a little of this. I want to mention Louis Sperry Schaeffer. I'm not going to give detail, but he was mentored by Schofield. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this, but I've only got about 120 seconds. Louis Sperry Schaeffer was discipled by Schofield as a young man. He became the successor in the church that was pastored by Schofield in Dallas. Schofield put tremendous pressure on Louis Sperry Schaeffer, a very kind of a quiet, very brilliant young man, that he should establish a seminary to replace all these seminaries that were going off to the left and abandoning true, legitimate Christianity. And so Louis Sperry Schaeffer founded a seminary in Dallas, where he was also a pastor, that was called the Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was the president and theologian in that seminary till his death in 1952. Dallas Seminary was a wellspring of dispensational influence. So vast numbers of very capable preachers and teachers went through the academic program there and filtered out into American culture to keep a persisting dispensational vision alive in American Christianity, even as evangelicals were losing ground in the political influence, you see, that they had once enjoyed. It now became kind of a different vision of what it was to be a Christian in this culture. Well, there were many notable people trained at Dallas, but the only one I'm going to mention that in the last time is, of course, our good friend Hal Lindsey, born in 1929, attended Dallas in 1958, worked with Campus Crusade for Christ until 1969. I actually heard him speak when I was at Whitworth, got on a bus with a bunch of kids and went down to the University of Idaho and heard Hal Lindsey speak. He looked a little different then, in 1968. He was a fabulous speaker. I was so excited, I was so juiced up, I wanted to be Hal Lindsey when I grew up after I went to that conference. The last message he gave, I'll never forget, it was like it was yesterday. 500 college kids gathered in this room, and it was a sermon on the end times. And he was giving his argument why, based on Russia, Soviet Russia, and different things that were happening in the world, and different kinds of weaponry and so on that he saw described in Revelation. He believed the return of Christ was imminent, and I remember him saying these words. He wasn't going to set a time, he wasn't going to set a date, but to him it was unimaginable that the rapture would happen any time later than 1975. That did get to me. I came back to Whitworth thinking, what am I doing in Whitworth? What am I doing in school? I got to drop out. I got to go do something meaningful, And fortunately, sane heads prevailed. I think Bruce Embry was one of them, kind of kept me, And so anyway, I stayed in school. I'm glad I did. But anyway, in 1970, he produced, of course, a book that became a bestseller and continues to be one of the bestsellers of the entire century. It has sold well over 15 million copies. It's entitled The Late Great Planet Earth. This is when dispensationalism got out of the evangelical ghetto and into the bloodstream of Americans across the board. And many people who didn't read the Bible or care about the Bible read this book and were fascinated by its content. And this, of course, is when this dispensational influence really did reach, in many ways, the peak of its influence and expression and power in our culture. I think it's probably safe to say that no publication has shaped American evangelical Christianity as much as that volume. I want to just conclude briefly with this thought. I want to say this as kindly as I can. Many people, I was once a dispensationalist. You may detect that, So I'm on a bit of a hobby horse here. I grew up in this tradition. And it was, in fact, I'm going to tell you a little further secret. The reason I came to First Presbyterian Church was because I was teaching at one of those Bible schools that was dispensational. And by teaching church history, I had come to believe that this is not the way it is. And I couldn't sign in good conscience a doctrinal statement I was required to sign year by year. And so, there were a lot of other things happening. So you know some of the rest of the story. A lot of things were sort of melting down in my life, but this was one of them. And I decided, I think I want to be a Presbyterian. and actually, it was in the fall of 1980, having left the school over that little difference, that I wound up here at First Pres. But my point in saying this, if you just indulge me for a minute, many sincere people believe this dispensational outlook. They are sincere Christian people. I have close friends, who are very much committed to this, and we share a warm Christian fellowship. I don't regard this as a cult or something like that. I hope you understand that. However, I do think that this particular approach and others like it are a huge distraction from what is really important. The book of Revelation begins with the words, He apocalypsis tu Christu Jesu. The apocalypse, the revelation of Christ. And I've met a whole lot of folks who get all juiced up about details in this morning's newspaper. And do you think ISIS are the locusts that are coming out of the abyss? And, all of this distracts us from the fundamental and important truth of Scripture, which is Christ is King. And that's where I think the critical mass of our faith and study needs to be rooted. Nothing wrong with doing a little speculating on the side, but when I see people utterly obsessed with ideas that are at best tangential and highly speculative, then it begins to make you wonder, is this as healthy as it could be in the life of faith? So I just want to say to all of us, whatever you may be, you may be here and be committed to dispensation. I say, God bless you, But I hope that all of us will at least rally to this proposition. Christ is King. He is Lord. To Him, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given. And whatever we do in the fringes of our speculation, let's never let it distract us from that fundamental truth of life and eternity. Amen.